Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The date is May 28, 1453. As an eerie lunar eclipse fades, two worlds hold their breath. Inside the ancient walls of Constantinople, a Roman emperor prepares to die for his city. Outside, in a sea of tents and bonfires, a 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed, stares at the silhouette of destiny. For 1,000 years, these walls have stood unbreached. But tonight, prophecy, ambition, and the roar of the largest cannon the world has ever seen converge. This is the story of the final hours of an empire and the forging of another in fire and blood. In the gilded halls of Edirne, a city of conquerors, a boy was born into a world he was not meant to inherit. It was 1432, and Sultan Murad II, a warrior weary of war and a poet at heart, welcomed his third son, Mehmed. This was not the heir apparent. He was a spare, a political afterthought in the brutal calculus of dynastic succession. His early life was a study in isolation. While his father sought solace in verse and contemplated abdication, Mehmed was sent to the provinces, a gilded exile to learn the harsh art of governance under the watchful eyes of stern tutors. He was a prince, yet he was a pawn, moved across the Anatolian chessboard at his father's whim. This distance did not breed affection. It bred a cold, calculating ambition. Within the young prince, a furnace of resentment and determination began to burn. He saw his father's weariness not as wisdom, but as weakness. He watched the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, glittering just beyond the horizon, a prize his ancestors had desired but never seized. It became an obsession, a focal point for a childhood devoid of paternal warmth. His tutors, men like the zealous cleric Akshamsaddin, did not temper this fire. They fed it. They spoke of destiny, of ancient prophecies, and of a city promised to a great Muslim conqueror. They told Mehmed that the conqueror would be him. This was not education, it was indoctrination. They were forging a key to unlock a city, but they were also shaping the soul of a boy who would learn a terrible truth early in life. To sit on the Ottoman throne, one must be willing to cast a shadow so vast and so dark that it could eclipse the sun itself. He was not just learning to rule. He was learning to want, to hunger for power with a ferocity that would terrify his own court and shake the foundations of the known world. Power is not merely forged in steel. It is born in the realm of belief. And for the Ottoman dynasty, no belief was more potent than the prophecy concerning Constantinople. For centuries, a sacred Hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself, had echoed through the courts and mosques of the Islamic world. Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will he be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. This was not a mere suggestion of military strategy. It was a divine mandate, a promise of celestial glory. Every sultan who reigned before Mehmed had felt its weight. They had besieged the city, their armies crashing against the legendary Theodosian Walls, only to be broken and turned back. The city, protected by God and geography, seemed inviolable. But in the court of Edirne, under the reign of Murad II and the watchful eye of his ambitious son, this prophecy was no longer a distant dream. It became a living, breathing force. Mehmed's tutor, Akshamsaddin, was more than a scholar. He was a mystic who saw the hand of God in the machinations of state. He whispered the prophecy into the young prince's ear, not as a possibility, but as a certainty. He interpreted dreams, read omens, and convinced Mehmed that he was the chosen one, the wonderful leader foretold 8 centuries earlier. This transformed Mehmed's personal ambition into a holy quest. To take Constantinople was to fulfill God's will, to prove his own legitimacy, and to etch his name into eternity. The psychological impact was immense. It gave him an unshakable, almost terrifying self-belief. While his father's viziers saw a reckless youth, Mehmed saw a man of destiny. The conquest was no longer a question of if, but when. The ancient words had become his compass, his justification, and his weapon. In 1444, the unthinkable happened. Sultan Murad II, grieving the death of his favored son and exhausted by endless campaigns, abdicated. He handed the most powerful throne in the East to a 12-year-old boy, his third son, Mehmed. It was a political earthquake. The predators of Europe, seeing a child ruler, smelled blood. A new crusade was launched from Hungary, eager to shatter the Ottoman state. But the greater threat came not from beyond the borders, but from within the palace walls. The Grand Vizier, Chandarlı Halil Pasha, a man who had served Murad with cunning loyalty, looked upon the young sultan with deep mistrust. He saw not a prodigy, but an arrogant, dangerously ambitious boy, obsessed with the impossible dream of Constantinople. Halil Pasha represented the old guard, the cautious aristocracy that feared the consequences of such a radical gamble. He saw Mehmed's single-mindedness as a threat to the stability of the empire. As the Crusader army advanced, chaos erupted. The elite Janissary corps, the Sultan's own slave soldiers, grew insolent. They marched on the palace, their demands escalating to open revolt, a test of the boy Sultan's authority. He failed the test. In the face of internal rebellion and external invasion, Halil Pasha made his move. He orchestrated a conspiracy of the court, sending secret missives begging Murad to return from his retirement and save the empire from his own son. It was the ultimate humiliation. Murad returned, not as a father, but as a savior. Mehmed was quietly deposed, sent away once more to the provinces, his first reign a catastrophic failure after only 2 years. The lesson was seared into his soul with the heat of betrayal. He learned that the word of a vizier could be a dagger, that the loyalty of an army was conditional, and that the throne was a seat of absolute solitude. He would never trust so easily again. The boy was gone. A cold, patient predator was born. When Sultan Murad died in 1451, Mehmed returned to the throne. He was now 19, and the court that had once dismissed him as a boy now faced a man forged in the fires of humiliation. His gaze was fixed, as it had always been, on the triple land walls of Constantinople. But he knew that to break them, he needed more than faith and a great army. He needed a miracle of engineering. He needed a monster. That monster came in the form of a man named Orban, a brilliant but mercenary Hungarian cannon founder. Orban had first offered his terrifying skills to the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI. But the dying empire was bankrupt. They could not afford his price, offering only a meager salary. It was a fatal miscalculation. Hearing of this master craftsman, Mehmed summoned Orban to Edirne. In the Sultan's court, the meeting was not one of a monarch dictating to a subject. It was a meeting of minds obsessed with a singular problem. Mehmed, a student of science and engineering, did not just ask if a cannon could be built. He asked Orban about the limits of metallurgy, the physics of ballistics, the precise mixture of copper and tin. He asked, "Can you cast a cannon of bronze with a bore large enough to throw a stone that will shatter the walls of Babylon itself?" When Orban, stunned by the Sultan's knowledge and limitless resources, assured him it was possible, Mehmed gave him a blank check. He provided funds, facilities, and hundreds of technicians. For 3 months, in a great foundry outside Edirne, a weapon of unprecedented scale was born. The Great Bombard, or the Basilic, was a behemoth over 27 feet long, capable of hurling a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. It was so vast, it took 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to move it. This was more than a weapon. It was a statement of will. In the molten bronze of the great cannon, Mehmed was forging his own ambition into physical form, a brutal, unstoppable force aimed directly at the heart of history. In the cold, calculating mind of Mehmed II, the conquest of Constantinople was not merely a military objective. It was a consuming obsession, fed by a deep and gnawing paranoia. He was a young sultan, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's reign and the whispers of viziers who had seen him fail once before. Chief among them was the powerful Grand Vizier, Sandarlu Halil Pasha, a man of the old guard who advocated for caution, a stance Mehmed interpreted as bordering on treason. The Sultan trusted no one. This profound distrust became the engine of a vast and sophisticated intelligence network, a web of shadows that stretched from his war tent into the very heart of the Byzantine palace. He needed to know everything: the state of the city's grain stores, the morale of its defenders, the secret dealings of the Genoese and Venetians, and the private counsel of the emperor himself. He craved information, as a starving man craves bread, believing that knowledge was the sharpest blade in his arsenal. But this was a war fought in whispers as much as it was with cannons. While Ottoman agents, disguised as merchants or defectors, moved through the decaying streets of Constantinople, Byzantine spies sought to penetrate the sprawling Ottoman camp. They were desperate to gauge the Sultan's true numbers, the readiness of his new artillery, and, most importantly, any dissent within his command. Mehmed, aware of these efforts, often walked his own camp in disguise at night, a phantom among his own soldiers, listening to their fears and boasts, searching for the slightest hint of disloyalty. His paranoia was a double-edged sword. It isolated him, forcing him to rely on his own formidable intellect, but it also sharpened his focus to a terrifying degree. He was not just besieging a city. He was dissecting an empire, nerve by nerve, secret by secret, ensuring that when the final blow came, there would be no surprises. In the spring of 1452, a year before the Great Siege, Mehmed made a move of audacious, brutal clarity. On the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly opposite a fortress built by his great-grandfather, he began to raise a monster of stone and mortar. This was Byzantine land, a mere few miles north of Constantinople. The act was not a prelude to war, it was the first act of war itself. The Emperor Constantine XI protested, sending envoys who were ignored and then executed. The message was clear: the time for diplomacy was over. The fortress was given a name that dripped with violent intent: Boğazkesin. In Turkish it means the straight cutter, or, more chillingly, the throat cutter. It was built to choke Constantinople, to sever its final artery to the Black Sea, from which Genoese ships brought grain and potential aid. The scale and speed of its construction were terrifying, a testament to the Sultan's iron will. Over 1,000 master masons and twice as many laborers worked relentlessly, day and night. Mehmed was a constant presence on the site, driving his men with a fanatic's energy, personally directing the placement of walls and towers. In just over 4 months, an impossibly short time, the fortress was complete. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, its walls thick enough to absorb cannon fire, its 3 great towers positioned to create a lethal, overlapping field of fire. He armed it with massive cannons, forging a fist of stone and iron that now clenched the throat of Europe. Every ship that passed was forced to lower its sails and pay a toll. When a Venetian vessel defied the order, it was blasted from the water with a single shot, its surviving crew impaled on the shore. Rumeli Hisarı was more than a fortress. It was a declaration carved into the landscape, a permanent monument to Ottoman power and a daily, suffocating reminder to the people of Constantinople that their world had shrunk to the circumference of their ancient walls. Within the legendary Theodosian Walls, Constantinople was dying long before the first Ottoman cannon was fired. It was a city of ghosts, haunted by the specter of its own magnificent past. Once the vibrant heart of a world-spanning empire, home to 1 million souls, it had withered into a hollowed-out relic. Fewer than 50,000 people now rattled within its vast 14-mile perimeter. Entire districts had fallen into ruin, their forums and colonnades overgrown with weeds and cypress trees. Farmers tilled soil in the shadows of crumbling aqueducts where bustling neighborhoods once stood. The grandeur remained. The golden dome of the Hagia Sophia still pierced the sky, but it was the grandeur of a mausoleum. For the inhabitants, life was a waking dream of anxiety and fatalism. They saw omens in every celestial event, in every strange cloud formation, whispering of ancient prophecies that foretold the city's fall. The psychological decay was as corrosive as the physical. A deep, bitter schism divided the populace, a wound that refused to heal. The attempt to unify the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches in exchange for military aid from the West was seen by many not as salvation, but as a profound betrayal of their faith. The cry, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," echoed in the streets, a testament to the lingering trauma of the Fourth Crusade, when Western knights had sacked their holy city 2.5 centuries earlier. This internal division left the city spiritually broken, fighting itself even as the enemy gathered at the gates. Food was scarce, soldiers were few, and the desperate appeals sent to the Christian kingdoms of Europe were met with deafening silence or empty promises. The last Romans were trapped, isolated not only by an Ottoman army but by history itself, waiting for an end that felt both impossible and inevitable. On the throne of the Caesars sat a man who was not a gilded aristocrat, but a soldier. Constantine XI, Palaiologos, had spent his life fighting on the frontiers of a shrinking empire, a hardened commander who understood the grim calculus of war. Now he bore the heaviest title in Christendom, a title that carried the weight of 1,500 years of Roman history. But in 1453, the title of emperor was not a crown, it was a death sentence. As Mehmed's armies enveloped his city, Constantine became its heart and soul. He was a tireless presence, a flash of purple imperial cloak seen atop the sea walls at dawn, in the armories at noon, and in the council chambers late into the night. He rallied his small, motley band of defenders, Greeks, Genoese, Venetians, and a handful of others, imploring them to forget their religious quarrels and national rivalries, to remember only that they were the last shield of the Christian world. Mehmed, perhaps holding a sliver of respect for his adversary, made a final offer. If Constantine would surrender the city, he and his court would be granted safe passage and given lordship over a wealthy province. He could live out his days in comfort and peace. For another man, it might have been a tempting offer. But Constantine was not another man. He was the heir of Justinian and Basil II. His reply, carried back to the Sultan, was a monument of defiance born from duty. "To surrender the city to you," he declared, "is not for me to decide, nor for any of its citizens. For we have all decided to die of our own free will, and we shall not spare our lives." On the final night, as Ottoman cannons fell silent in eerie anticipation, Constantine went to the Hagia Sophia. There, in a final, heartbreaking act of unity, he received Holy Communion alongside his Orthodox and Catholic subjects. Then he rode to the walls, cast off his imperial regalia, and took his place among his soldiers, ready to die not as an emperor, but as the last Roman. The Golden Horn. A deep, protected inlet. A natural harbor that had been the city's lifeline for a millennium. It was the soft underbelly of Constantinople, yet it was sealed by a weapon of pure, brute force engineering. A colossal iron chain, stretched from the city to the Genoese colony of Galata. Behind this barrier, the combined fleets of Byzantium, Venice, and Genoa rested, a lethal dagger aimed at any force foolish enough to attack from the sea. For Mehmed, this was more than a tactical problem. It was a personal affront. His grand navy, built to dominate the waves, was rendered impotent, bobbing uselessly in the Sea of Marmara. His cannons could pound the land walls into dust, but as long as the Golden Horn remained a sanctuary for enemy ships, the city could be resupplied, its spirit could endure. The siege could drag on for months, even years. The chain was the linchpin of the entire defense, a symbol of the city's stubborn refusal to die. Frustration gnawed at the young sultan. His engineers tried to shatter the links with cannonballs. They merely skipped off the water. His admirals proposed suicidal ramming attacks. They were dismissed as madness. In his tent, poring over maps under the flicker of oil lamps, Mehmed's mind wrestled with the impossible. If he could not go through the chain or under it, he would have to go over. Not the chain itself, but over land. The idea was audacious to the point of insanity. To transport an entire fleet of 70 warships, not across a narrow isthmus, but over the steep, forested hill of Galata. It was a feat of logistics and willpower that bordered on the mythical. On the night of April 22nd, the plan was set in motion. Thousands of soldiers and laborers worked in near silence. A road of greased wooden planks was laid. Under the cover of darkness, urged on by whips and promises, men and oxen began to haul the ships, sails unfurled as if sailing on a sea of earth. To the defenders on the walls, the sounds were baffling. The splintering of wood, the lowing of beasts, the muffled shouts of men. They could see nothing. But when dawn broke, the sun revealed a sight that shattered their reality. An Ottoman fleet, fully assembled and battle-ready, now floated upon the waters of their Golden Horn. It was not a military maneuver. It was a miracle of dark engineering, a psychological cataclysm. God, it seemed, was not the only one who could move mountains. The air itself seemed to hold its breath on April 6, 1453. The formalities of medieval warfare, archaic yet sacred, were observed. An emissary from Mehmed, under a flag of truce, delivered the final ultimatum to the gates of Constantinople. Surrender the city, and the people would be spared, their property and freedom of worship guaranteed. Defy him, and they would face the sword. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, a man bearing the name of the city's founder and its first Christian emperor, listened to the terms. He was not a king of a vast empire, but the custodian of a glorious memory, the warden of a dying dream. His reply was steeped in the tragic dignity of his station. To surrender the city was not his to decide, nor any of its citizens. They would all, by their own will, die in its defense. The choice was made. Fate was sealed. Outside the walls, Mehmed received the news not with rage, but with a cold, almost serene finality. This was his destiny, foretold by the prophet himself. He was the instrument of a divine will, and the city was his promised inheritance. The psychological chasm between the two leaders was absolute. For Constantine, it was a holy duty to defend the last bastion of Christendom, a vigil he was prepared to keep until death. For Mehmed, it was a holy conquest, the culmination of 7 centuries of Islamic ambition. The whispers in the Sultan's camp were of prophecy and glory. The whispers in the city were of ancient omens and terrifying portents. An icon of the Virgin Mary that slipped and fell during a procession, a strange, blood-red fog that enveloped the city for days. Angels or demons? Salvation or damnation? The answer came with a sound that ripped the sky apart. Mehmed gave the signal, and his grand bombard, the monstrous cannon named Basilica, fired its first stone. The 1,200-pound projectile screamed through the air and slammed into the ancient walls, the impact shaking the very foundations of the city. It was more than an attack. It was a declaration. The 1,000-year reign of the Caesars was ending not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap that echoed through eternity. They were not merely walls. They were a legend cast in stone and mortar, a geological feature of history itself. The walls of Theodosius had stood for over 1,000 years, a triple-layered girdle of impenetrable might. For 40 generations, they had been the shield of the Roman Empire, turning back the ambitions of Avars, Arabs, Rus, and even Mehmed's own great-grandfather. They were a masterpiece of military architecture. First, a wide, deep moat, a man-made chasm. Then, a low, crenellated wall, Beyond that, a higher outer wall studded with 96 towers. And finally, the magnificent inner wall, nearly 40 feet high and 16 feet thick, punctuated by even larger, more formidable towers. This was not a single line of defense, it was a killing field, an interlocking system designed to bleed an invading army white. For the defenders, these walls were more than stone. They were a physical manifestation of God's favor, a testament to the permanence of their city and their faith. To stand upon them was to stand with the legions of the past, with the saints and emperors who had guarded this sacred ground. Leading the defense of this stone behemoth was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese soldier of fortune with a genius for siege warfare. He and his 700 elite soldiers were the backbone of the city's resistance, their expertise a vital counter to the Ottomans' sheer numbers. In the early days, the walls held. Ottoman infantry charges broke upon them like waves against a cliff. The defenders, fighting with desperate courage, rained down arrows, stones, and boiling oil, repulsing every attack. But Mehmed possessed a weapon the walls had never been designed to face: gunpowder. His massive cannons, forged by the Hungarian engineer Orban, were instruments of a new age of warfare. They did not seek to overwhelm the defenders with men. They sought to dismantle the very concept of the wall's permanence. Each day, the great bombards roared, their stone cannonballs pulverizing sections of ancient masonry. And each night, under the cover of darkness, the citizens of Constantinople, men, women, and children, worked frantically to repair the breaches with barrels of earth, rubble, and wooden stockades. They were patching a dying giant, their feverish efforts a testament to their will. But for the first time in a millennium, the legend was cracking. The stone was failing. And through those cracks, doubt began to seep into the heart of the city. The siege settled into a brutal, soul-crushing rhythm. It was a contest not of grand maneuvers, but of sheer, grinding attrition. Each dawn brought the same earth-shattering roar of the cannons, followed by hours of relentless bombardment that filled the air with stone dust and the metallic scent of fear. Then came the assaults. Waves of Bashi bazooks, irregular troops driven forward by promises of plunder, would hurl themselves at the makeshift repairs in the walls, only to be cut down in a storm of arrows and crossbow bolts. After them came the disciplined Anatolian regiments, and finally, the elite Janissaries, their chilling war cries rising above the din. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of destruction and frantic repair, of bloodshed and exhaustion. Hope was a currency that dwindled with every passing sunset. Mehmed, growing impatient, employed new tactics. He sent his Serbian miners to tunnel beneath the foundations of the walls, hoping to collapse entire sections or create a secret entry point. But the defenders had their own master of subterranean warfare, a mysterious engineer named Johannes Grant. He devised countermines, listening for the faint tap-tap-tapping of Ottoman pickaxes. He met them in the suffocating darkness underground, fighting grim, claustrophobic battles with smoke, fire, and sword. Above ground, the Byzantines unleashed their most terrifying weapon, Greek fire. Siphoned from bronze tubes, this secret, hellish liquid would erupt in streams of unquenchable flame, clinging to siege towers, ships, and men. It burned on water, and its victims died screaming, their armor melting to their skin. It was the fire of demons, a psychological horror that could break the nerve of the bravest soldier. Yet, for every Ottoman siege tower burned, another was built. For every mine foiled, another was dug. Doubt began to fester in the Sultan's own camp. The siege was costing a fortune in gold and, more importantly, in the lives of his best soldiers. His Grand Vizier, the cautious Sandarlu Halil Pasha, openly questioned the wisdom of this bloody endeavor, whispering of a truce. The Janissaries, accustomed to swift victories, grew sullen and restless. For weeks, the city refused to fall. It bled, it starved, it prayed, but it did not break. It was a war of wills, a slow, agonizing grind where every hour was paid for in blood, and both the besieger and the besieged wondered how much longer they could endure. History is not only written by kings and conquerors, it is often forged in the fires of ambition and opportunism. In the story of Constantinople's fall, one name echoes with the thunder of this truth: Orban. A master cannon founder, a Hungarian engineer of unparalleled skill, Orban was a man whose loyalty belonged not to a flag or a faith, but to the highest bidder. His craft was the new dark magic of the 15th century, the power to turn stone walls, the very symbol of permanence, into dust. Initially, he offered this power to the man who needed it most, Emperor Constantine XI. Within the ancient palace, Orban laid out his proposal, a cannon of such magnitude it could shatter any defense. The emperor understood its value. He saw the city's salvation in the engineer's designs. But the Roman Empire was a ghost, its coffers empty, its glory a memory. Constantine could offer only a meager stipend, a shadow of what Orban's genius was worth. Insulted and impoverished, Orban saw no future in a dying world. So he traveled north, to the vibrant, pulsing heart of the rising Ottoman power in Adrianople. There he was brought before the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II. Here was no weary monarch of a failing state, but a man burning with a singular, world-altering ambition. Mehmed did not ask Orban if he could build a cannon. He asked him if he could build one capable of bringing down the walls of Babylon itself. The Sultan offered him riches, resources, and respect beyond his wildest dreams. For Mehmed, money was no object. Destiny was the only currency that mattered. In a massive foundry, Orban and his army of craftsmen brought a monster to life, the basilic, a great bombard nearly 30 feet long, capable of hurling a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. When it was test-fired, the sound shook the earth for leagues, a prophecy of the doom it would soon deliver to the Queen of Cities. Orban's story is a stark lesson in the mechanics of power. The Byzantines had faith and 1,000 years of history, but Mehmed had wealth, vision, and the loyalty of the man who held the future of warfare in his hands. On the evening of May 28, 1453, as the sun set on the Roman Empire for the last time, a strange and mournful peace descended upon the doomed city. The thunder of Orban's great cannon fell silent. The war cries of the Ottoman host faded into an ominous quiet. Within the walls, the people knew this was not a reprieve, but a prelude. In this final, sacred twilight, they gathered in the one place that had been their anchor for 1,000 years, the Hagia Sophia. For one last time, the great church, the Church of Holy Wisdom, opened its colossal bronze doors to its children. Inside, a scene unfolded that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. Centuries of bitter religious schism dissolved in the flickering candlelight. Greek Orthodox priests stood beside Latin Catholic cardinals. Venetian sailors who had long looked upon the Greeks with contempt knelt in prayer beside Genoese soldiers, their sworn rivals. At the center of it all was Emperor Constantine XI, his face a mask of resolute despair. He was no longer just the emperor of the Greeks, but the father of a dying flock. A great procession moved through the cavernous space, the mosaics of Christ Pantocrator and the Virgin Mother looking down from the golden domes, their timeless eyes seeming to weep for the tragedy unfolding below. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of whispered prayers. A final liturgy was held, a desperate appeal to the God who had seemingly abandoned them. The sermon spoke not of victory, but of martyrdom, not of earthly kingdoms, but of the eternal one to come. It was a eulogy for a city, an empire, and a world. Men who would be mortal enemies on the morrow embraced as brothers, confessing their sins, asking for forgiveness. They were Romans, all of them, for one final night. As the last hymns echoed and faded into the vast, dark dome, the congregation filed out, their faces illuminated by torches, ready to meet their fate on the walls. The Hagia Sophia was left in silent, hallowed darkness, having witnessed the final Christian prayer it would ever hear. While the last prayers echoed in the Hagia Sophia, a different kind of ritual was taking place in the Ottoman camp. In his magnificent tent, surrounded by maps of the city he so coveted, Sultan Mehmed II prepared for his final gambit. He was a young man, but on this night he carried the weight of centuries. He had staked his entire future, the legitimacy of his reign, and his very life on this single, audacious siege. Failure was not an option. His own janissaries, the slave soldiers who formed his elite guard, would be the first to depose a sultan who showed weakness. This was his crucible. He summoned his pashas, the old and the new. The cautious Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, who had long advised against the campaign, stood in tense silence. Opposite him was Zaganos Pasha, Mehmed's fiery tutor, a man whose ambition mirrored the Sultan's own, urging him towards this final, bloody consummation. Mehmed listened, but his decision was already made. Destiny, he believed, had called him to this moment. Leaving his tent, he moved through the camp, a sea of 100,000 fires stretching to the horizon. The air hummed with a terrifying energy, the sharpening of swords, the chanting of prayers, the low, rhythmic beat of war drums practicing the rhythm of the final assault. He ascended a small rise, from where he could see the dark silhouette of Constantinople, its defiant walls still standing against the night sky. There he made his final vow, not to God, but to his men. He rode before them, his voice ringing out in the darkness, promising them a reward as old as war itself. The city was theirs. For 3 days they would have unlimited plunder. The gold, the treasures, the people, all would belong to the victors. He reserved only the buildings and the physical city for himself. He was not merely a conqueror seeking loot, he was an emperor claiming his new capital. His words electrified the army, turning their fear and fatigue into a feverish, insatiable hunger. As he returned to his tent, Mehmed was no longer just a sultan. He was the instrument of fate, a man on the verge of extinguishing one world and giving birth to another. Before the first hint of dawn on May 29th, the world ended. The Ottoman camp erupted in a single cataclysmic roar. Hundreds of drums, trumpets, and horns blared, a sound designed to shatter the soul before the body. The great cannons, silent through the night, unleashed their final, furious barrage. This was it. The day of judgment had come for Constantinople. Mehmed's plan was a masterpiece of brutal attrition. First, he threw forward the Bashi bazooks, the irregulars, a chaotic wave of fighters from across the empire, driven by the promise of plunder. They were human fodder, sent to exhaust the defenders, to absorb their arrows, their Greek fire, their strength. For 2 hours they crashed against the walls and were repulsed, leaving heaps of dead and wounded in the moat. Then came the second wave, the disciplined, heavily armored Anatolian regiments. They advanced with ladders and siege engines, focusing their attack on the weakened Mesotachion, the central stretch of the land walls. The fighting here was ferocious, a desperate, close-quarters struggle on the ramparts. Yet still, the walls held. The defenders, led by the giant Genoese soldier of fortune, Giovanni Giustiniani, fought with the strength of men defending their very existence. But as the sun began to rise, Mehmed played his final decisive card. He unleashed the Janissaries. In perfect, silent columns they marched forward, a river of white turbans and gleaming steel, the finest soldiers in the world. They hit the walls like a thunderbolt. At that critical moment, fate intervened twice. A small, unsecured gate, the Kirkoporta, was discovered and breached, allowing a handful of Ottomans to raise their banner on a tower within the city, spreading panic. Almost simultaneously, Giustiniani, the heart of the defense, was grievously wounded by a cannon fragment. His retreat from the wall, though understandable, broke the defenders' spirit. Seeing the chaos, Emperor Constantine XI knew the end was here. Casting off his purple imperial regalia, he drew his sword and, with his last loyal men, charged into the surging tide of Janissaries. He died as he had lived, the last Roman emperor, fighting for a lost Rome. The line broke. The Janissaries poured through the breach and the cry went up, "The city is taken!" A world that had stood for 1,123 years was gone in a single morning. History is not always forged in the clamor of great battles, under the shadow of siege towers and the thunder of cannons. Sometimes it turns on the smallest of hinges, on a single moment of human error. As the main assault raged at the St. Romanus Gate, as Justiniani fell and the Janissaries surged forward, the fate of Constantinople was being sealed elsewhere, not with a roar, but with a whisper. It was a small, insignificant postern gate in the northern Byzantine Walls, known as the Kirkoporta. In the chaos of the pre-dawn assault and the desperate rush to man the primary defenses, someone had left it unlocked. An oversight, a forgotten detail in a defense plan 1,000 years in the making. A handful of Janissaries, probing the walls for any conceivable weakness, found it. One can only imagine their disbelief, their hearts pounding not with the fury of combat, but with the shock of discovery. Here was the key, unguarded. They slipped through the opening, a quiet stream of death trickling into the city's veins. They were not a grand army, but they didn't need to be. They swiftly overpowered the skeletal guard on the inner wall, climbed a nearby tower, and unfurled the blood-red Ottoman standard. For the defenders fighting for their lives blocks away, the sight was a psychological cataclysm, a flag deep within their own walls. The cry went up, spreading like wildfire along the ramparts. "The city is taken." It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Panic shattered the disciplined shield wall. Soldiers abandoned their posts, convinced they were surrounded, desperate to save their families. The entire defensive line, which had held for 53 days against the world's most powerful army, did not break. It evaporated. A millennium of imperial glory, undone by a single unlocked gate. It was the city's unseen wound, a fatal puncture that bled the empire dry from the inside out. For centuries, in the mythology of the Turkic peoples, there was a legend of the Kızıl Elma, the red apple. It was the ultimate prize, the symbol of a world-spanning destiny, the city that must be conquered. For Mehmed, that city was Constantinople. As the Ottoman flags appeared inside the walls, that myth became terrifying reality. The disciplined roar of the attacking army dissolved into the chaotic shouts of conquerors. The promised 3 days of plunder had begun. The city, once the jewel of the world, became a labyrinth of terror. Janissaries who had been brothers in arms moments before now became rivals, racing through the streets to claim the richest spoils, gold, relics, and people. The air filled with the splintering of doors, the crash of priceless art, and the screams of the terrified. In the midst of this pandemonium, the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, met his end. Seeing that all was lost, he cast aside his purple imperial regalia, keeping only his sword. He wanted no special treatment, no capture for ransom. He would die as a soldier, with his city. He plunged into the oncoming wave of Janissaries and was swallowed by the fray. His body was never definitively found, a ghost emperor buried anonymously beneath the rubble of his own fallen empire. His death was the final, silent punctuation mark on a story that began with Augustus Caesar. The bells of the city's 1,000 churches fell silent, one by one. The lamentations of the conquered were drowned out by the triumphant cries of Allahu Akbar from the victors. The red apple had been plucked from the tree. For Mehmed, it was the taste of destiny fulfilled. For the survivors huddled in the ruins, it was the bitter taste of ashes, the flavor of a world that had ended. Mehmed did not ride into the city with the first wave. He was not a mere general. He was the inheritor. He waited until the initial storm of violence began to subside, then made his grand entrance in the afternoon. He rode through the Grand Mese Street. the imperial way of the Caesars, now littered with debris and corpses. He was surrounded by his viziers and imams, a solemn procession moving through a landscape of his own making. His destination was not the emperor's palace, but the city's soul, the Hagia Sophia. As he approached the colossal structure, its scale silenced even the most hardened of his men. This was the heart of the faith he had just defeated. Inside, thousands of citizens had taken refuge, clinging to a prophecy that an angel with a flaming sword would appear at the central column and drive the invaders out. The angel never came. As Mehmed's guards forced the massive bronze doors, a wave of terror and despair washed over the huddled masses. The Sultan dismounted. In a gesture of profound symbolic weight, he stooped, took a handful of earth from the ground, and sprinkled it over his turban, an act of humility before God, acknowledging that all power, even his, was transient. He walked into the cavernous interior, his eyes drawn upward to the great dome and the golden mosaics of Christ and the Virgin Mary that shimmered in the gloom. He saw the weeping refugees and declared that their lives and freedom were secure. Then he walked towards the altar, turned to face Mecca, and an imam by his side ascended the pulpit to proclaim the Adhan, the Islamic call to prayer. In that moment, the world pivoted. The great cathedral of Eastern Christendom became the chief mosque of the Ottoman Empire, and Mehmed was no longer just a sultan. He was Fatih, the conqueror, the new Caesar of a new Rome. The fall of Constantinople was more than the end of a city. It was a geopolitical earthquake that sent shockwaves across the globe, shattering the medieval world and forging the modern one in its place. The immediate consequence was the final death of the Byzantine Empire. For 1,123 years, it had been the shield of Christendom, the living continuation of the Roman Empire. Now, that unbroken line stretching back to antiquity was severed forever. A profound psychological blow struck Christian Europe. The supposedly impregnable city had fallen, and the Ottoman Sultan now sat astride the crossroads of the world. From the ashes of the conquest, a great migration began. Byzantine scholars, artists, and scientists fled westward, carrying with them a treasure trove of classical Greek manuscripts and knowledge that had been lost to Europe for centuries. Their arrival in Italy was a crucial catalyst, pouring fuel on the intellectual fires of the Renaissance. Economically, the world map was redrawn. With the Bosphorus now an Ottoman lake, the traditional land routes to the east, the fabled Silk Road, were choked off. European kingdoms like Portugal and Spain, starved for the riches of the Orient, were forced to look to the seas. The quest for a new route to India, one that bypassed Ottoman control, would lead navigators like Columbus and da Gama to stumble upon new worlds, initiating the Age of Discovery. The fall of Constantinople did not just end an empire, it created a power vacuum, shifted the centers of trade and knowledge, and forced a terrified, ambitious Europe to look outward. Mehmed's conquest was an act of finality, but it was also a violent, world-altering genesis. From the rubble of Constantinople, Istanbul was born, and from the death of one age, another, far more global and turbulent, was violently delivered,